The day it happened started like any other school morning. My son was excited. It was the school presentation day, the one where parents were invited to watch students present their projects in front of the class. He had worked on his project for 2 weeks. Carefully cutting pictures, writing notes, practicing his speech in front of the mirror. He was nervous, but proud. I promised him I would be there. But something unexpected happened that morning. A work emergency kept me from arriving on time. So my parents offered to go instead. They're his grandparents, I thought. They'll support him. I had no idea that decision would turn into the worst moment of my son's school life. Because by the time I arrived at the school, the entire hallway was silent. And my son was standing outside the classroom, trying not to cry. I rushed toward him immediately. His project board was still in his hands. The edges were bent, like he had been gripping it too tightly. "Hey, what happened?" I asked softly. He didn't answer right away. He just looked down at the floor. Then he whispered something that made my heart drop. "Grandma said my project was embarrassing." I froze. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the classroom door opened. And I saw my parents standing inside. My mother was shaking her head in disappointment. My father looked irritated. Then my mother said something loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is the kind of work you're proud of." Several students were still inside the classroom. And suddenly, every pair of eyes turned toward my son. My son stood there quietly. His hands were trembling. The colorful project board he had worked on for weeks now looked small in his arms. My mother crossed her arms and sighed loudly. "We came here to support you," she said. "But this is just disappointing." A few students nearby started whispering. One boy in the back even laughed. My son's face turned red. "Grandma." "I tried," he said softly. But my father stepped forward. "Tried," he scoffed. "When we were young, we didn't show work like this in public." The words were sharp. Too sharp for a child to hear. I stepped into the classroom quickly. "That's enough," I said firmly. But the damage had already been done. My son looked like he wanted the floor to open and swallow him whole. And that's when someone else walked into the room. The principal. And the moment he heard what was happening, his expression changed completely. The principal stopped in the doorway. He looked from my parents to my son, then to the project board in his hands. "Is everything all right here?" he asked calmly. No one answered at first. My mother spoke before anyone else could. "We're just explaining to our grandson that this project isn't very impressive." The principal's eyebrows lowered slightly. He walked closer to my son. "May I see it?" he asked gently. My son hesitated, then slowly handed him the board. The principal studied it carefully. Pictures were glued across the page. Handwritten notes. Small drawings in the corners. It was simple. But it was clearly made with effort. After a moment, the principal looked up. "This project shows creativity," he said. My parents exchanged confused looks. But the principal wasn't finished speaking. And what he said next made the entire classroom fall silent. The principal placed the project board gently on a desk. Then he looked directly at my parents. "In this school," he said calmly, "we encourage effort and confidence." The classroom had gone completely quiet. Every student was watching. He pointed at the board. "This project shows imagination, research, and hard work." My mother frowned. "But it looks childish," she replied. The principal shook his head slightly. "Of course it does," he said. "He's a child." A few students tried not to smile. My father crossed his arms. "We were just trying to motivate him." But the principal's voice became firmer. Motivation should never humiliate a student in front of their classmates. My son slowly lifted his head. For the first time since I arrived, someone in that room was defending him. And the principal wasn't finished yet. Because the next thing he said made every student in the classroom look at my son differently. The principal turned back toward the project board. He picked it up again and held it so the class could see. "Do you know what I see here?" he asked the students. No one answered. He pointed to one of the drawings. I see a student who spent time thinking about his idea. Then he pointed to the notes my son had written. I see someone who tried to explain his topic in his own words. A few students leaned forward to look closer. Then the principal said something unexpected. I also see something many adults forget. He looked around the classroom. Courage. My son blinked in surprise. Standing in front of your classmates and sharing your work isn't easy, the principal continued. Many adults are afraid of public speaking. Some students nodded quietly. Then the principal turned to my son. And yet, you were brave enough to try. For the first time that day. My son looked proud again. But the principal wasn't done. Because he had one more thing to say. And this time, it was directed straight at my parents. The principal slowly placed the project board back on the desk. Then he turned toward my parents. His voice was calm, but firm. Children remember moments like this, he said. My mother looked slightly uncomfortable. We didn't mean to embarrass him, she replied. The principal nodded. I believe you, he said. But intentions don't always erase the impact. The room stayed silent. Every student was still listening. He continued. When adults criticize children in front of their peers, it doesn't motivate them. He paused for a moment. It teaches them to feel ashamed of trying. My son looked down again, but this time, not from embarrassment. From emotion. The principal gently placed a hand on my son's shoulder. In this school, he said clearly, we celebrate effort, not perfection. Then he looked at the class. And I think everyone here should hear his presentation. My son's eyes widened. Because suddenly, the moment he thought had ruined his day, was about to become something very different. My son looked at the principal nervously. Right now, he asked quietly. The principal smiled. Yes, he said. Right now. A few students moved back to their seats. The classroom suddenly felt like a stage again. But this time, no one was whispering. My son slowly walked to the front. His hands were still shaking a little. I could see he was scared. But the principal stood near the desk, giving him an encouraging nod. Take your time, he said. My son took a deep breath. Then he began explaining his project. At first his voice was small. But as he talked about the pictures he chose, and the ideas he wrote, his confidence slowly started growing. Students began listening carefully, and something unexpected happened. A few of them started asking questions. For the first time that day, my son was being heard. As my son continued presenting, the classroom atmosphere completely changed. Students leaned forward. One girl raised her hand. I like your drawing, she said. Another student nodded. Yeah, the idea is actually really cool. My son looked surprised. A few minutes earlier he had been embarrassed. Now his classmates were interested. The principal stood quietly near the back of the room, smiling slightly. My parents were silent. For the first time, they weren't criticizing. They were just watching. When my son finished speaking, there was a brief moment of silence. Then someone started clapping. Another student joined. Within seconds, the entire classroom was applauding. My son looked shocked. But the principal raised his hand again. Because he had one more thing to say. And this time, it was meant for the adults in the room. The applause slowly faded. The principal stepped forward. I want everyone to remember something, he said. He looked around the classroom. Confidence in children doesn't grow from criticism. He paused. It grows from support. My parents avoided eye contact. The principal continued calmly. When children are learning, mistakes are normal. He pointed toward the project board. But courage, the courage to stand up and try. That deserves respect. Several students nodded. The message was clear. The classroom wasn't just hearing a speech. They were witnessing a lesson. Not about school projects, but about how adults should treat children. My son stood quietly beside the board, still processing what had just happened. And then the principal said something. That made the entire moment even more powerful. The principal turned toward my son. "I think this project deserves to stay on display in the hallway," he said. The class gasped. The hallway display was usually reserved for the best presentations. My son's eyes widened. "Really?" he asked. The principal nodded. "Yes." He lifted the board carefully. "This project represents creativity and bravery." Then he looked toward my parents again. "And those qualities should never be mocked." My mother looked embarrassed. My father shifted uncomfortably. But the moment wasn't about them anymore. Students began gathering around the project. As the principal walked toward the door, he placed the board on the display wall, right in the center, where every student walking through the hallway would see it. My son stared at it in disbelief. And for the first time that day, he smiled. When the class ended, students walked past the display in the hallway. Several of them stopped to look at my son's project. One boy said, "That's actually awesome." Another added, "Yeah, you did a good job." My son looked proud again. The embarrassment from earlier had disappeared. My parents slowly approached us. For once, they had nothing to criticize. The principal walked by and gave my son a reassuring nod. "Keep creating," he said. On the way home, my son held his head higher. The moment that could have destroyed his confidence had turned into something completely different. Because one person chose to stand up for him. And sometimes, that's all a child needs. To believe in themselves again. Respect.